Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session, Understanding the True Value of Pre-Employment Screening. You've got Robert here and Caitlin. We're both from Activate. We're doing a 30 minutes Fast 30 webinar to give you an understanding of what pre-employment really looks like now in 2020. So thanks for joining us this morning. Let's take a quick look at what is it that you want to be doing when you're doing a pre-employment health assessment. There are so many different types of pre-employment health assessments, and screening is definitely on the rise. But what you want to be looking for is identifying the risks and predicting the likelihood of injury, illness, and claims. So most pre-employment health assessments, according to the research, are really only identifying people who have health issues. They're not identifying people who may be at risk of an injury, may be at risk of an illness, such as a psychological illness or a workplace-related illness. And most importantly, and this is where a lot of medicals fail, they don't identify the people who are at risk of lodging a claim now and in the future. The key thing really is finding the safest applicants. And the safest applicant isn't just the person who went through their medical and got a pass. The safest applicant is someone who isn't going to lodge a claim against you in the future. How can we identify those people and either exclude them from the candidate pool? And I'm not saying discriminate, I'm saying exclude them from the candidate pool, because you have a duty of care to ensure the health and safety of all of your employees, particularly your prospective ones. So when we do our medicals, we are looking carefully at the work health and safety requirements of those roles. And that's why it's very important to have a good task analysis, isn't it, Caitlin?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of our consultants here, we do work in workplaces a lot, so we're very aware of the physical demands, psychosocial demands of every role. And certainly when we do these pre-employment health assessments, that's half of the consideration when we're looking at someone's risk for future injury, whether that's psychological injury or physical injury. We really do have to consider that job role that person's applying for. And I think that doesn't happen in all pre-employment health assessments that is done, basically. A lot of the time, you won't even perhaps give the job role to the person who's doing your assessments. So they're not going to be as aware of the risks to that prospective employee who's having that assessment.
So what are some of these more specific recommendations that you're often giving in a medical? Is that over the phone you're giving that advice, or also in your reports?
Yeah, so in the reporting that is done after the assessment, all of the recommendations would be in there. But it is really important to have that verbal communication with an employer who's onboarding, because some things you can just present in an easily to understand way verbally.
Yeah.
And there may be some things that you want to talk about as part of their interview process that you can't necessarily write down well on the paper.
It's a lot harder, isn't it, to articulate something in writing, particularly if it's a bit ambiguous, like a person's behaviour at the assessment might be the reason that you have a concern, but there isn't anything you can necessarily say was a problem, but the person may be inhibiting their movement, or they may have been a bit sheepish about their psychological history or their past medical history.
Yeah.
And those things all add weight to when you're doing these risk assessments.
Absolutely.
And of course, that's the thing that a pre-employment health assessment really is. It's a risk assessment. But most of the times when we do these health assessments, and especially those that are carried out by medical practitioners in the field, is they're doing a health assessment. So they're identifying whether the person is healthy. Now, we're not saying that isn't a good thing, but what we're saying is that really identifying the risk associated with the work health and safety requirements in your business, and particularly the inherent requirements of the job? Because You want to have allied health practitioners who have a good understanding of the work environment. What's the job actually like? At the extreme range of that role, whether they're the physical or psychosocial demands, what is going to be the impact on this person who's turning up into our rooms today? And so the whole notion of pass and fail medicals is really a thing of the past, but it's still very much setting the scene and the tone for when we do these medicals. In fact, most of our customers are still looking for a yes and no answer. And we coach them and educate them to understand that there really isn't a yes or no. It's really about what is the risk factor and how high do you dial up the risk of injury, illness and claims risks, isn't it?
Yeah. And what can you do as an employer to, although someone may have some risk with the job role that they've applied for, just to make sure that you can get all of the information you need, but also have all the recommendations as well that you need to support them into the workplace. You might be in a situation where you can't be picky about who you're hiring and you definitely need some staff, but at least doing an assessment that looks at the risk, you're aware of those things. And I think that's the most important thing as an employer, but also that applicant can be made aware of those things as well. And, you know, will be more conscious of that when they're working with you, of their risks in the workplace.
In fact, the reason that Activate has steered away from pass-fail or yes-no medicals is because we know the labour market is tough for employers, getting the right staff, onboarding them, doing the interviews, getting that pool of candidates is very hard. So by the time you've sent them off to a medical, the chances are that you really do want to employ this person. So our risk assessments help you go forward with that person by giving you a set of recommendations. And it is vital that you implement those recommendations. If you're going to onboard someone, what is it about their medical history, their injury, illness and claims predictability that you need to be including in the conversation that you have with them when you onboard them? So there's no point us doing these rigorous risk assessments if you're not taking into consideration the risks that we have identified and the recommendations that we made. And this is your opportunity to say, hey, John, we want to employ you, but from the medical that was carried out by Activate or by our provider, we can see that there are a number of issues that you need to address. We want this to be a condition of your employment. This is not discriminatory. This is exercising your due diligence and your duty of care as a future prospective employer. We also want to we've called this the deterrent effect. So this isn't about you deterring the person from being employed. This is actually about explaining to the person that you have an onus of responsibility for the management of your health, the management of your psychological well-being, and the management of this injury risk or predictability factor. So if someone has had a knee injury and the GP has said to them, you may need to have a knee replacement in 2 to 5 years, that's alarm bells for you, isn't it?
Definitely, but it also means that that person, if you do onboard them, they're going to know that you know that history and they're going to be much more open to communicating it with you if it does or when it does become a problem. And they're also going to be aware that you know that it was actually something that wasn't sustained at work as well. Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right. And we call this the deterrent effect. So it sounds a little bit cruel, but it's actually exercising your due diligence and duty of care by saying, look, John, from the medical that was completed, we can see that you've got an unstable knee and your history tells us that you may require surgery in the future. What we want to do is make sure that you manage this condition. We want to make sure you see your doctor and a physiotherapist regularly, and you enshrine that in their employment agreement. Now, without doing that, then you really haven't made the best use of the investment in your pre-employment medical program. You may as well have all of those risk identifiers in your employment contract. Now, it could be that you just have a conversation with that person, you document that and you have them sign off on that. Later on in the session, we'll show you a sample letter that we craft for employers to help them onboard people who have identified risks. And we highly recommend you consider that. And this is, again, not with the view to discriminating against that person, actually to help them on the journey of remaining healthy and injury-free.
I think then as well, you're going to identify those people who are willing to take responsibility for their own health and well-being. If I was someone who did one of these pre-employment health assessments, I had a knee injury, for example, and my employer said that they wanted me to, do an exercise program, strengthen it, get perhaps a letter from my doctor to discuss, where it's at and how it's limiting me at the moment. If I wasn't willing to go ahead with those things in order to be employed, then it's not the right job, and perhaps I'm going to then go and look for another job where I don't have those requirements, but I will unfortunately be at a higher risk of re-injury because that employer might not care as much. So these pre-employment health assessments, the recommendations you get are enabling you to have better communication with your future staff.
That's a great point. They should be seen as enabling you to onboard that person, accepting that there are risks with any employment of any person, regardless of age, regardless of function. Of course, there are risks. Every workplace has a range of risks, and your employment provider should understand what those risks are. And they're not just physical. So just doing functional assessments is actually not a predictor of whether someone is going to have an injury. And the research doesn't support that pre-employment medicals actually work or functional assessments work. So here we are doing about 250 of these a month. When you read the latest research, and it's as late as 2017, the Cochrane Review did a review of all the research studies that looked at pre-employment medicals and found that there wasn't any real conclusive evidence that they work. So what are the real levers then? The real levers are what we call the deterrent effect. So explaining to a person that they have the onus of responsibility. Yes, we have a no-fault scheme, and that's also part of the problem with the workers' compensation legislation nationally. We do have a no-fault scheme. So anyone can say that any condition is a result of their workplace activity. So even more, you need to be looking really carefully at their past medical history, their psychological history, and determining the risk of injury, the risk of illness, and more importantly, the risk of a claim, because that's the part that will impact you more financially than anything else.
And I think what the research behind the pre-employments, I think when we look at that and say that there's not a lot of evidence, it's highly likely that there was no follow-through after these pre-employment assessments. Employers haven't supported these particular workers with the right recommendations following, and that it has just been a real tick and flick thing. Assess someone's health and that's it and you're done. No, it needs a lot more than that.
And interestingly, it's not that medical doesn't actually still have a deterrent effect. So sending someone for a pass-fail medical probably still has this desired effect that we've been talking about, the deterrent effect, but it doesn't actually help you onboard someone and place that onus of responsibility on them. So the onus of responsibility has a twofold effect. It acts as a deterrent effect, in other words, deterring the person from making a claim for something that is essentially a pre-existing vulnerability. And this is what we believe the deterrent effect really is. And it's the most important lever that you have in doing these pre-employment assessments. I think the other crucial thing too is that psychological risks are now enshrined in legislation. So you have a duty of care to identify the physical risks associated with your work activity. You also now have a duty of care to identify psychological hazards. So what does that mean? Well, someone who has a pre-existing psychological condition may be more susceptible to having a psychological issue in your workplace. You want to be identifying that person and making sure that they have a good mental health care plan in place to manage their condition. And I think there's one case recently where we identified someone had a significant mental health issue.
Yeah, that wasn't being addressed, unfortunately. So our recommendation really there was that they need to address their mental health state before they're employed. Yeah, because they just, we're not in a good place.
And that was a very difficult decision for us to make. But during the assessment, the worker brought a number of issues to light, and we felt that he was going into an environment where he was going to be placed under enormous psychological strain. He was not under a mental health care plan. He had recently had a significant psychiatric episode requiring hospitalisation. He couldn't establish any evidence that he was under the care of a psychiatrist or a clinic or even a psychologist. We recommended to the employer that until he was able to demonstrate that they not go forward with onboarding. And in this instance, he then made a death threat against the employer and also made threats to our assessors. We actually had to lock down our building for 2 weeks and put a safety plan in place with the New South Wales Police to mitigate the risk of homicidal activity. Now, that is an extreme example, but that's just happened in our business in the last 6 weeks, and we've been through a really difficult process. So you can't discount the impact that an unmanaged psychological or psychiatric issue can have in your business. And it's our job to try and identify those people and make sure that they have a good plan in place. We're not discriminating against people, but we're making sure that they have a good, robust plan in place. We have a question from Hayley. If the results are not pass-fail, then what do the results of the Activates report look like? It's a good question. The report is really a risk assessment, and we do our best not to pass or fail people because it's not our job to say someone cannot do the job. It's our job to interpret the findings from the assessment. It's our job to match that with the inherent requirements of the job and develop a risk profile.
Yeah, so on that report, we list, what is contributing to the person's risk score, but then how to reduce that risk if they are onboarded or even before they are onboarded.
Time check. Okay, so let's have a look at where we're up to with a pre-employment assessment. So what does a pre-employment assessment actually look like? Well, we like to say it's about risk profiling. And if you compare risk profiling to a pass-fail medical, now keeping in mind the research says most medicals that are conducted are on the basis of this pass-fail model, and most medicals in Australia are still carried out by medical practitioners. And there's very little relevance to the inherent requirements of the job. So here's just a chart of what we would do versus what a typical medical looks like. And this is the research supporting it. So we carry out a very comprehensive self-reported history profile. So the person uploads all of their medical history, all of their injury history, all of their accident history, and that that's the backdrop for how we look at risk.
Just to talk on that as well, recently we've started using an online profiling medical history tool. So that's a part of all of our pre-employments now. And there's actually been research to show that people do tend to tell the truth a lot when they're doing a form online, as opposed to when they come into the clinic, they're in a bit of a hurry, they want to tick all the boxes, they don't have time to actually consider. Whereas this online reported health history means that they can do it anytime in their spare time, on their phone. They just have a lot more time to detail it. And you don't also have someone sitting across from you waiting for you to finish it. So you don't feel like you're in a rush, and you feel like you can and you should write everything down that is in your health history.
And you want to get this job, right? So you're completing this formal assessment where you're declaring that you're telling the truth, and you're not doing it to impress the assessor who's rushing to get you through to the next medical. You're actually doing it and actually recounting your history. So we do find, interestingly, from our own research, that people are more likely to, as Caitlin said, tell the truth in an online screen than they are in a face-to-face. And the other thing is, we can see that there is a lot more risk being detailed in an online setting than in the physical setting. So we're still thinking about how and why that is the case. We suspect that even in our own medical settings, the practitioners have a bias. They want to help this person get the job. But that's really not our job. Our job is to identify the risk of injury, illness, and claims. It's not to pass that person. But it's very hard to instill that different hat that you want your allied health practitioners or doctors to have in this instance. Our job is not to make that person pass. Our job is not to make that person a suitable candidate. Our job is to be very objective and look at matching risk with inherent requirements of the job. With our onboarding program, what we do suggest is that you write the person a letter. Now, this is a sample of the letters that we often write on behalf of our employer customers. And if you can see carefully on the screen, we're saying, thanks for coming to the medical. We can see that you've reported that you've had a lower back injury in 2015. You have an issue with your core strength and cardiorespiratory fitness. You're using ongoing medication to manage your back pain. So what we're really saying here is, we don't want this to be our problem. We're prepared to employ you, but we need you to exercise caution and exercise your duty of care to prevent that from becoming a problem in our business and also becoming a chronic condition for you.
Yeah.
So then we've got a letter we're wanting to get from your doctor as a condition of your employment, and that is that you have a medication management program, a planned integration of an exercise program and a weight management program, and one that focuses on your pre-existing lower back injury. Now, we think it's these types of letters that act as a deterrent. Now, this fellow knows that we've identified that they've got a problem. We've opened up that conversation during the contract of employment discussion, the final sign-offs. He knows he's got this letter on the file. He knows that he's got to play the game of getting himself in a place where he doesn't have an ongoing back problem.
This could be a real turning point as well for this individual. You know, if he is really committed to this particular job role and really excited to be a part of that particular workplace that's going to employ him, this is a whole life turnaround for him if he actually addresses these things.
That's right. And without having this robust conversation, the person is probably just going to go back to their bad habits anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And we see this time after time. People really just want to pass their medical. We are making it more difficult for people to think that all they have to do is pass their medical. And we suggest to you as employers, this is the time to be more critical of who you're employing. This isn't about fast-tracking employment so you can get that person on a bus or you can get that person in a paddock. This is really about making sure you exercise your due diligence, because if you do this homework now, you're going to be in a much better position if that person ever makes a claim or if that person ever develops a condition which they think is work-related. That was a fast 30 minutes. I suspect that some of you may have some questions, so please, we have a few minutes to answer some questions. Comments are also a good idea. So feel free to ask some questions and make some comments. Ultimately, our job is to make sure we're giving you that opportunity to be more resilient as an organisation, that you improve the quality of your onboarding. And you're also looking at mental health and physical health. So, and that means you're having an ongoing discussion with that person about their mental and physical health. This isn't just a medical that you put into the bottom drawer and never look at again, but many of our customers do that, don't they?
Definitely. We see it a lot. Yeah, the recommendations are quality and they're going to help reduce your risk. So it is important. It's not just a pre-employment medical, it's part of your whole onboarding of people.
It's a work health and safety risk assessment. For those of you who wear that hat in your business, think about it from that perspective. It's not a medical. Yes, everyone still calls them a medical, but really they're a risk assessment. And they're the best way to mitigate your future liabilities. And of course, ad nauseum, we say this to everyone. If you spend the money up front preventing an injury, an illness or a claim, you are way in front than trying to rehabilitate someone. At the moment, rehabilitating someone with a psychological injury, the average cost is now $70,000. So that would pay for a lot of medicals in a year, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
We have some more questions. One from Mary. Do you recommend that the full results of the pre-employment medical are disclosed to the candidate regardless of what the results are? Well, what a great question that is, isn't it?
Yeah. For us, I think if you're onboarding that person, I think it's great to have that discussion. Yeah, absolutely, and definitely inform them of the results. I think it comes across a lot better if it is a little more informal and it's more of a verbal discussion. The way the reports are written, it's very structured, it's very straightforward, it's very blunt. And when you're reading something about yourself, like, you know, you're morbidly obese or you scored this and that's below average, that doesn't feel so good.
Yeah.
So to give someone the report is not the best idea and won't set you off on a good foot. But I think to have the verbal discussion with the person is fantastic and inform them of any area where they can improve themselves and where you're going to help them when you're onboarding them.
Certainly, Mary, writing a letter like the one we showed you is a great way of going about mitigating your future liabilities, and we strongly encourage you consider that. The other thing we should say that's very important as well is please don't tell people they just have to pass their medical. Don't tell people you're the only candidate doing the assessment.
Yeah.
Ideally, the medical assessment is just part and parcel of the recruitment process. No one should be guaranteed any position. We just had a situation 2 weeks ago where the hiring manager guaranteed this person a position. When we did the assessment on her, we identified that she had a number of very serious conditions that would make it very difficult for her to be a veterinarian for that business. And unfortunately, when we uploaded the risk profile to the work health and safety manager, he said, we cannot hire this person, but the hiring manager has already guaranteed her the position. So we had to really build a more robust framework for onboarding her and making sure she was mitigating those risks that we had identified. And it was a very good conversation. She's obviously a medical vet, so she was highly engaged in that process, and she was very sober about how she went about dealing with it. And it was a very good outcome in the end. But it certainly poses a problem if you're telling people they just have to pass their medical.
Yeah, and I think that ties really nicely in with the next question about where in the recruitment process you should be doing these pre-employment health assessments.
Excellent question too.
Yeah, really good. So look, there's different things that you can do. So we've got, obviously, there's the online pre-health questionnaire that applicants can be sent. This is a lower cost option, so it's something that's easily accessible. We sort of recommend that that happens earlier stages. It is really up to you, but basically, from what Rob was just saying, it's important never to guarantee a role for someone before you complete the pre-employment health assessment, but it's also just as important to never say that their employment is based upon the pre-employment health assessment either.
That's right. There are many options available now. The online screen is a very cheap way and a fast way of identifying the risks associated with employment. So from that online screen, you can determine whether you want to proceed to a physical medical assessment, or you can say, look, we have enough information to say this person poses a significant risk given inherent requirements of the job, and we're not going to proceed. So there are many options. Of course, we're here today to talk about pre-employment screening. We're not here to sell you the myriad options, but you want to be considering that there are costs involved in doing these assessments, but there are faster and cheaper ways of going about it and getting really good quality information up front. So maybe your short list becomes a bit bigger and you're putting more people through the channel of a digital screen before you go for a physical screen.
Great. I think there might be one more
All right.
question.
I think is there one more question?
Yeah, if you just scroll down.
Right, okay, there's a question from Joe. Do the authorities realise what they created at the end of the day if he or she aggravates a physical or mental problem and it doesn't go back to the previous employee, or it's a psychological pre-existing problem? Surely this has to be brought to the attention of the people that make these laws.
I wish that we had all of our power to bring some attention to these things, but unfortunately that's completely out of our control. So as employers and health professionals, we just have to do the best that we can for the people that we're onboarding or considering to onboard, considering that there are, some things that will work against us.
But Joe, in relationship to your question, what we do, if we identify someone has a condition, a medical, psychological, physical, or that they can make a claim against their previous employer, we often recommend that they do that before you proceed with employment. And there are many instances where we've said to someone, they said, oh, look, I've actually got a back problem. When did the back problem begin? Well, it happened in my last job. And what we say to them and to the prospective employer is, I wouldn't onboard this person unless they made a claim against their previous employer. This is the only protection you have, Joe, in this instance. You can exercise your right to not employ that person unless they make a claim against their previous employer. So if their physical, psychological condition can be attributed to a work-related incident, why would you make it your incident when it could be someone else's liability? So all of this comes about by doing a robust risk assessment, and that's why it's important to do risk assessments, not medical health screens only. There was a question from Mark Allen. So with the sample letter, would you make this a condition of employment? Can you legally do this? Yes, you can legally do that, Mark. Absolutely, you can legally do that, and we would make it a condition of employment. You can have an informal discussion, as Caitlin has suggested. You want to have an informal discussion because people can be very defensive when you say you were below average, you scored in the obese category. Many people have never been labelled as obese, and this can be very confronting for people, particularly when they're trying to get a job with you. So having an informal discussion is a good way of opening up the conversation about the risks that were identified, but following through with a letter that indicates clearly what your expectations of their behaviour are and also how they're going to manage their condition through their GP. Again, it's got to be an onus of responsibility on them to manage the conditions that were identified at assessment. So also a very good comment there. Again, thanks for your time, and we appreciate that very much, and we'll see you all soon sometime. Thank you.